Hey there. You ready for a deep dive? Today we're going to tackle Immanuel Kant and, specifically his ideas about religion.
Oh,
I know what you might be thinking, Kant religion. Didn't he kind of like shut the door and all that?
it's a really common misconception,
Yeah.
even among philosophers, to be honest with you.
Right.
Kant, he actually dedicated a surprising amount of his work to the relationship between faith and reason. So he
Right.
wasn't really trying to disprove God.
Okay, so not like a Richard Dawkins kind of thing.
Right, exactly. Yeah, more like,
Got it. Got it.
so what was he trying to do then?
Well, what was he up to?
Think about it this way. At the time, a lot of theological arguments, they were super reliant on these really intricate systems of logic.
Right.
And Kant, he saw that as overly intellectualized dogma.
Hmm.
And he really believed that this was pushing religion away from what he had called common understanding.
So it's almost like he was trying to make religion more accessible.
Exactly. Yeah. He wanted to kind of strip away those layers of complex theological argument and just ground it in something much more fundamental, something that everybody could,
Right, yeah.
grab onto.
So there's this really famous quote from Kant, right? I have therefore found it necessary to deny knowledge in order to make room for faith.
Right.
What did he even mean by faith there? How is that different from just like blind belief?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
So for Kant, faith, it wasn't about, just checking your brain at the door and accepting whatever dogma
Right.
without question.
Yeah.
It was about committing to these moral principles, even when we can't definitively prove them through pure reason. It was a matter of practical necessity for living a moral life.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So if he wasn't trying to use logic to prove or disprove God,
Yeah.
how did he approach that whole concept then of a higher power?
He focused on this idea of the ens realissimum.
That was realism,
The
yeah.
most real being, which was kind of the foundation for a lot of the traditional arguments for God's existence.
It's-
Think of it as this ultimate ideal possessing, every possible perfection.
Okay.
The most perfect being.
So was he saying that this ends realismum actually exists out there somewhere?
Not necessarily. No, he said we can definitely construct this idea in our minds, right?
Okay.
But that doesn't automatically,
Right.
poof, make it real.
Right.
It's kind of like when we imagine the perfect vacation,
Yeah.
crystal clear water, these pristine beaches,
Yeah.
endless relaxation.
Like that Corona ad.
Exactly.
Right.
Just because we can picture it doesn't mean it actually exists out there, right?
Right.
In the world.
So is he essentially debunking all the classic arguments for God's existence?
He critiques them for sure.
Yeah.
He takes on the ontological, the cosmological, and the
design argument.
design argument.
I've
yeah.
always found that one kind of convincing.
Yeah.
The idea that the universe is so complex that it just points to this intelligent designer.
It is compelling, and actually Kant himself, he acknowledged its strengths.
Right.
What he pointed out, though, is that even if we accept, the idea of a designer based on that apparent order of the universe,
Right.
it doesn't necessarily mean that we've arrived at that classic, all-powerful, all-knowing God that we imagine,
Right.
Maybe it just points to a really, really skilled architect who set things in motion, but isn't actively managing every little detail.
Okay. Yeah. I see that.
Right.
So where does that leave Kant on the whole God question then? Would you say he leans more towards deism or theism?
He's very particular about those terms, actually.
Okay.
So for Kant, deism is the belief in a God who created the universe, but then kind of takes this hands-off approach,
Okay.
not interfering in the world. Theism, on the other hand, is belief in a God who is very active and involved in human affairs.
So is he team deism then?
This is where it gets really interesting. He actually calls the deistic God useless.
Useless. Wow. Why would he say that?
It all goes back to morality.
Okay.
If there's this God out there who isn't concerned with our ethical choices,
Right.
then Kant argues that the whole concept of morality kind of becomes meaningless,
Yeah. Yeah. I could see that.
What's the point of being good if there's no ultimate judge, no consequences for our actions?
It's why bother?
Right, exactly.
That makes a lot of sense. It seems like this idea of the highest good is really central to understanding how Kant approaches religion then.
Absolutely, yeah. He doesn't just tear down those traditional arguments for God.
Right.
He builds his own case for a different kind of understanding of religion.
I'm intrigued. What exactly did Kant mean by the highest good then?
For him, it's the ultimate goal.
Yeah.
It's the ideal state where happiness and being morally worthy are perfectly aligned. Imagine a world where, like, the kindest, most ethical people are also the happiest, and where those who act selfishly, they actually face consequences for their actions.
Sounds pretty utopian.
It does, right?
But how does God fit into all this?
Yeah.
Why would we need God to exist to achieve this highest good?
That is the question.
Yeah.
That gets to the heart of it, and that brings us to Kant's postulates of practical reason, and that's where our deep dive continues. It's so interesting how Kant, this philosopher who's so focused on, like, reason and logic,
Right.
ends up arguing for things like God and immortality.
Yeah, you'd think that'd be more at home in, like, theology or something,
Yeah.
not like hardcore philosophy.
Right, it seems kind of paradoxical.
Yeah, why do you go from like pure rationality to those kinds of conclusions?
Well, remember, he's not saying these are proven facts. He calls them postulates.
Okay.
These necessary assumptions. We need to make sense of morality in our pursuit of, that highest good.
God.
He was so concerned with ethics, and he really believed that reason on its own couldn't fully explain our moral experience.
All right, right.
It's like there's this piece missing.
So these postulates are like the bridge then
Yeah, like a bridge.
between the world of reason and like our moral aspirations.
That's a great way to think about it, yeah.
Okay.
Like, take the postulate of God, for example.
Okay.
Kant saw God as the ultimate guarantor of this highest good,
Okay.
Because in the world we live in, good people suffer sometimes.
All the time.
Yeah, and bad people seem to get away with stuff.
Yeah, it doesn't feel very fair a lot of the time.
Exactly. And that's why Kant said, look, if the highest good is going to have any real meaning,
Right.
there's got to be some intelligence out there ensuring that justice ultimately prevails,
Even if we can't see it.
even if we can't see it, right? Because
Yeah.
our human perception is limited.
So it's not about proving scientifically that God exists. It's more about saying that God has to exist for the highest good to even be possible.
Exactly. Yeah, it's like a necessary condition.
Yeah, I get it.
And it's a very similar logic with immortality.
Okay.
Remember, the highest good is this ideal state of perfect alignment between happiness and being morally worthy.
Right.
But humans,
We're not perfect.
no, we're not. We make mistakes and fall short. We definitely don't reach moral perfection in one lifetime.
Yeah, no, that's asking a lot.
Right. So are you saying we need immortality to, like, have enough time to reach the highest good?
Kinda.
Yeah.
Kant saw immortality as this necessary condition for us to keep striving towards moral perfection,
Okay.
And keep getting closer,
Yeah.
even if we never totally get there in this life.
So it's like this ongoing process.
Right, it never ends.
It never ends.
Which kind of makes sense if you think about it. Like, why even bother trying to be good
Right.
if there's no chance of ever actually achieving that?
Exactly. Yeah.
It's like these postulates are kind of like motivators then
Yeah.
to get us to be better people.
I think so, yeah. I think he saw them as kind of giving our moral lives a foundation,
Okay, yeah, like a purpose.
a sense of purpose. Yeah. Why bother being good if there's no ultimate justice,
Right.
No chance of reaching moral perfection?
So what if Kant's right? What if, like, pursuing that highest good is what religion is really all about?
It's a really compelling idea, for sure.
Yeah, that's a lot to think about.
It makes you think about, like, how his own religious background influenced his ideas,
Yeah, I was just thinking that he was raised Christian, right?
What? How does that fit with all this philosophy?
Was he like a heretic or something?
Well, it's complicated.
Okay.
Kant was a critical thinker, remember?
Yeah.
So he examined those Christian doctrines. He was trying to separate what he saw as, like, genuine rational religion,
got it.
based on those universal moral principles
Right.
from what he saw as, like, superstition.
Oh, so he wasn't afraid to step on some toes.
No, not at all.
Can you give an example?
Yeah, one that really stands out is his rejection of vicarious atonement. That idea that Jesus died for our sins.
Okay, break that down for me because
Yeah.
I'm not a theologian.
Okay, so basically, vicarious atonement means that Jesus took the punishment for our sins,
Okay.
so we don't have to face the consequences of our actions.
Interesting.
Yeah, Kant really didn't like that idea.
Why not?
Well, because it goes against his whole belief in individual moral responsibility.
Ah, I see.
For him, each person is accountable for their own choices.
Makes sense.
You can't just, like, pass the buck onto someone else.
Right, no one's getting a free pass.
Exactly. And this really shows that tension between Kant's approach and these traditional religious doctrines.
Right.
He wasn't trying to make up a whole new religion or anything.
Okay.
He wanted to show how reason could make religious belief better.
Right.
Make it fit with a moral life based on making your own choices and pursuing the highest good.
It's like he's trying to find a middle ground.
Exactly. He wanted to respect faith, but also hold it up to light of reason.
He was walking a tightrope.
Definitely. And he was super controversial in his time, and people are still arguing about his ideas today.
Yeah. It's probably why we're still talking about him.
Right. It's not about finding easy answers with Kant. It's about grappling with those big questions.
It's like he gives you a new way to think about those timeless questions.
Exactly, yeah.
So I know Kant had some interesting things to say about organized religion and the idea of a universal church.
Oh, yeah, definitely he did.
But I think that needs its own deep dive.
It does. Yeah, we could spend a whole episode on that.
For now, let's shift gears a bit.
Okay, yeah.
And talk about Kant's later work.
All right.
Especially that unfinished manuscript of his, the Opus Posthumum.
Yes, the Opus Posthumum.
It's like we get a glimpse into how his thinking on God might have changed towards the end of his life.
It's like a philosophical mystery novel or something.
I love a good mystery. What kind of clues are we talking about here?
So there are these passages in the Opus Posthumum where Kant seems to move away from the idea of God as this separate being,
Oh, cool.
this being that exists outside of us.
Right.
He starts to describe God as this ideal or a thought object that helps us make sense of the world, and our place in it.
So is he saying that God is just like a concept, then not a real being?
It's tough to say for sure because the Opus Posthumum was never finished.
Oh, right.
It's like we're trying to finish a puzzle, but there are some pieces missing.
Yeah, I hate when that happens.
But that's part of why studying Kant is so rewarding.
Okay.
He's a philosopher who always makes you think deeper, question your assumptions, and wrestle with those huge questions about, life and morality and what's real.
Well said, and I think our listeners are ready to do some wrestling of their own.
Yeah, I think so.
Let's take a quick break, and then we'll come back and talk about some of the key takeaways from our deep dive into Kant and religion. All right, so we journeyed deep into the mind of Kant and explored his views on religion.
It was a journey.
It was a trip, right?
Yeah.
From his, critiques of the traditional arguments for God's existence to that whole idea of the highest good and those postulates of practical reason.
Yeah.
It's like there's so much there.
So much to think about.
What I find so interesting is how Kant was able to bridge that gap between reason and faith.
Yeah, that's a tough one.
A lot of philosophers before him just couldn't quite figure it out.
They couldn't crack it.
He didn't just, dismiss religion as irrational.
Right.
He really saw faith as this legitimate part of being human.
Yeah, he thought it was necessary, especially for morality.
Right, so it's not about blindly believing things.
Yeah.
It's more about committing to these moral principles, even if we can't, prove them with science or logic.
Exactly. It's like a commitment to something bigger than yourself.
So for someone who's just starting to learn about Kant's ideas on religion,
Yeah.
what are the key takeaways?
Well, first off, remember, Kant wasn't anti-religion,
Right.
He just pushed back against trying to mathematically prove God exists.
Right.
But he still thought faith was a super important part of being human.
Especially for morality and ethics and all that.
Exactly.
And that brings us to the second big idea, the highest good.
Yeah, that's huge for Kant.
It's like this driving force behind his whole philosophy of religion.
Totally. He thought the goal of life was to reach that state where happiness and moral worthiness are perfectly in sync.
It's like that perfect balance.
Yeah, a beautiful ideal.
And then you've got the postulates of practical reason.
Right. God and immortality.
They're these assumptions we have to make.
Yeah.
If we want that whole highest good thing to even make sense.
Because how can you strive for something if you don't believe it's possible?
It's like Kant saying if you're serious about being a good person,
Yeah.
you got to act like those postulates are true.
You got to have faith.
Even if you can't whip out a scientific equation to prove it.
Exactly.
And then there's that whole thing with Kant and his Christian upbringing.
Right.
It's kind of wild how he was raised in the church.
Yeah, but still questioned everything.
But he wasn't afraid to challenge dogma,
No, he was fearless.
But he also recognized the importance of religious symbols.
Yeah.
And the role they play in shaping our moral compass.
He understood that religion had a powerful influence on people.
So where does this all leave us? What does it mean for our listeners who are trying to wrap their heads around Kant?
Well, I think Kant's philosophy of religion gives us this challenging, but ultimately really hopeful vision. You know,
Okay.
he's calling on us to take responsibility for our actions, to strive for that highest good, and to embrace a faith that's based on reason
Yeah.
and creating a more just and ethical world.
So it's not a faith that shies away from the tough questions.
No, it embraces them.
It uses them to learn and grow.
Exactly.
Well said. I think that's a great place to wrap up our deep dive into Kant's philosophy of religion.
Yeah, I think so too.
His work is complex,
It is.
and there's always more to uncover.
Layers upon layers.
But hopefully we've given our listeners a good starting point,
Foundation.
some fertile ground for their own philosophical explorations.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining us on the deep dive where we take these big ideas
The really complex stuff.
and try to make them a little bit easier to understand.
Yeah, we break it down.
Until next time, keep those minds curious.
And keep asking those big questions.
We'll see you next time.